came to the restaurant for Dad's anniversary, but my stepmother blocked the entrance, saying family only while my father said nothing, so I left with my son, froze all their accounts, and reclaimed my car down payment until they begged me to return. Hey Reddit, my name is Elena, and I still remember the exact moment my world shifted. I was standing at my father's front door with my 7-year-old son Leo beside me, watching him hold a carefully wrapped gift in his small hands. He was wearing his best polo shirt because, as he'd told me multiple times during our preparations, Grandpa's birthday is special, Mama. The drive from Munich had taken us 5 hours, and Leo had chattered excitedly the entire way. He couldn't stop talking about seeing his beloved grandfather, sharing stories about all the things they would do together during our weekend visit. My father, Victor, had always been the center of our small family universe. After my mother died when I was 17, it had been just the two of us for years, and we had built a relationship that felt unbreakable. Or so I thought. When Victor married Natasha 3 years ago, I genuinely tried to welcome her into our family. She was elegant and well-spoken, and she seemed to make him happy after years of loneliness following my mother's death. I wanted nothing more than for my father to find companionship and joy in his retirement years. But looking back now, there had been signs that I chose to dismiss. Small things at first, comments about how some people didn't understand proper family dynamics, subtle suggestions that maybe I was too dependent on my father. She had a way of redirecting conversations when I called during their dinner time, always with a polite explanation about not wanting to interrupt their meal. I dismissed these as adjustment issues, telling myself that blended families took time to find their rhythm. The morning of Victor's birthday, I had felt genuinely optimistic about our visit. Leo had spent weeks at school making a special photo album, carefully drawing colorful borders around pictures of him and his grandfather. The photos captured their best moments together. Fishing trips, intense checkers matches, and afternoons spent building model rockets in Victor's garage. My father had been a consistent and loving male figure in Leo's life ever since his biological father walked out when Leo was 3. They had developed a bond that transcended typical grandparent relationships. They were genuinely best friends. I had booked us into a nice hotel in Hamburg for the weekend, planning to make it a proper celebration. The trunk of my Audi was loaded with gifts, including an expensive watch I had saved for months to buy. Leo had even packed his checkers set, hoping for their traditional tournament that had become a beloved ritual between grandfather and grandson. When Natasha opened the door, her smile was perfectly polished and completely cold. There was something in her expression that immediately put me on edge, though I couldn't quite identify what it was at first. "Oh, Elena," she said, her voice carrying a tone of mild surprise, as if our arrival was unexpected. What struck me immediately was that she didn't move aside to let us in. Instead, she remained positioned in the doorway, effectively blocking our entrance to what had always been my family home. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," she continued, her words delivered with the kind of practiced politeness that wealthy women perfect pleasant on the surface, but with something sharp and unyielding underneath. Behind her, I could see straight through to the dining room table, and my heart sank as I realized what I was looking at. The table was set for exactly 4 people. Through the kitchen doorway, I caught a glimpse of my father's sister Petra and her husband Klaus, who had apparently been invited to this intimate family celebration. There were no place settings for Leo and me. "We decided to keep things small this year," Natasha continued, her voice carrying that particular tone that some people use when they want to sound reasonable while delivering unreasonable news. "Just immediate family." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt Leo's small hand tighten in mine, and I could sense him stepping closer to my leg, instinctively seeking comfort as the adult tension became palpable, even to his 7-year-old awareness. Behind Natasha, my father appeared in the hallway. At 65 years old, Victor was still handsome in his pressed shirt and good trousers. The same man who had taught me to drive walked me down the aisle at my wedding and held Leo in the hospital the day he was born. But now he stood there and said absolutely nothing. "Dad?" My voice came out smaller than I had intended, carrying all the confusion and hurt I was feeling in that moment. Victor looked at his shoes, then at Natasha, then anywhere but directly at me. When he finally spoke, his words were halting and weak. "Well, you know how it is, love. Natasha's organized everything and—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the air like a noose, incomplete and devastating. That's when Leo spoke up, his 7-year-old voice cutting through the adult tension with devastating clarity and innocence. "But Grandpa's my best friend," he said, his confusion evident in every word. The silence that followed felt eternal. I watched my father's face crumble slightly as he glanced down at Leo, and I saw something that might have been regret flicker across his features. But still, he said nothing. He just stood there. My father. This man I had adored and trusted my entire life, and chose his wife's cruelty over his grandson's broken heart. Right then, I said, my voice steadier than I actually felt in that moment. We'll be going. I turned Leo around gently, placing my hand on his shoulder to guide him back toward our car. He didn't protest or ask questions, but I could feel the confusion radiating from his small body like heat. As we walked back down the path we had just traveled with such anticipation, I heard Natasha's voice behind us, bright and artificially cheerful. Sorry for the confusion, she called out, her tone suggesting this was merely a minor scheduling mishap rather than a deliberate exclusion. Perhaps next time we can all coordinate better. The drive back to the hotel passed in heavy, oppressive silence. Leo stared out the window, occasionally sniffling but trying to hold back tears. I kept my hand steady on the steering wheel while my mind raced with hurt and a growing anger that was beginning to crystallize into something much more focused and determined. At the hotel, I ordered room service while Leo lay on his bed, still clutching the photo album he had made so carefully at school. He kept looking toward the door, as if his grandfather might still appear to make everything right again. The hope in his periodic glances toward the entrance broke my heart all over again. Mama, he finally said, his voice small and uncertain, did I do something wrong? That question, innocent and heartbreaking, was when the hurt crystallized into something harder and sharper. It might have been fury, or perhaps it was simply justice finally asserting itself. No, sweetheart, I told him, pulling him close against me on the hotel bed. You did nothing wrong, nothing at all. After Leo finally fell asleep, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day, I sat in the hotel's business center with my laptop and phone. I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking through what I was about to do and all of its implications. Then, I began making a series of very deliberate phone calls. First, I called the credit card company. The supplementary card I had given my father and Natasha for emergencies had seen quite a bit of activity lately. I discovered as I reviewed the recent statements. Natasha's weekly spa appointments, shopping trips to Vienna, expensive dinners at restaurants I couldn't even afford myself. The card had a limit of 45,000 euros, representing my entire emergency fund. I need to cancel this card immediately, I told the representative who answered. Fraudulent activity. Next, I called my bank. The down payment for my father's new Tesla, 180,000 euros that I had liquidated from my mother's inheritance, could be recalled, I learned. It hadn't technically been structured as a gift. I had set it up as a family loan with no repayment schedule, thinking I was being generous and flexible. But loans, I realized, could be called in when circumstances changed. I need to initiate an immediate recall of funds, I explained to the night manager, someone I had dealt with before during my divorce proceedings. It's a family loan with no formal agreement, but I have documentation of the transfer. The third call was to the airline. Our return flights weren't scheduled until Monday, but I changed them to Sunday morning. We would be gone before my father even woke up, before there could be any awkward attempts at reconciliation that would only confuse Leo further. Finally, I called my lawyer. Eric was a friend from university who had handled my divorce and understood the complexities of family dynamics when money and emotions intersected. Elena, it's past midnight. Are you all right? He asked, clearly concerned by the late hour of my call. I explained the situation briefly, and Eric listened without interruption, allowing me to lay out all the facts before responding. The credit card recall will be immediate, he said when I finished. The Tesla down payment might take 48 hours, but given the circumstances and your documentation, it should go through without any problems. Are you sure about this? This isn't something you can easily undo once it's in motion. I looked toward the bedroom where Leo slept, still wearing his good shirt, still clutching his grandfather's gift that would never be given. I'm sure, I said. By morning, my phone was buzzing constantly with incoming calls. Natasha's number appeared again and again on my screen, but I let them all go to voicemail while Leo and I packed our things and checked out of the hotel. I wanted to hear what she had to say, but on my terms, not hers. The evolution of her voicemails told a fascinating story of dawning realization. The first message was bewildered and slightly condescending, delivered in the same, politely superior tone she had used at the door. Elena, darling, there seems to be some issue with the card, she said, her voice carrying the assumption that this was simply a banking error that could be quickly resolved. Could you call me back? The second voicemail, left just an hour later, carried a note of irritation and social embarrassment. The Tesla dealership is saying there's a problem with the payment. This is quite embarrassing. Please call immediately. By the fifth voicemail, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth or politeness. What exactly do you think you're doing? This is completely inappropriate behavior. Your father is beside himself. Then came a text message from Victor, short and desperate. You've made your point? Can we please talk? I showed Leo the message while we waited at the airport for our flight back to Munich. He was old enough to understand the basic situation, and I had always believed in being honest with him about family matters, within reason. What do you think, little man? Should we talk to Grandpa? I asked him. Leo considered this seriously, the way he approached everything important in his 7-year-old world. After a moment of careful thought, he looked up at me with those wise eyes that sometimes seemed far too mature for his age. Did he say sorry for hurting our feelings? He asked. I read Victor's message again, looking for any acknowledgement of what had actually happened, any recognition of the pain he had caused. No, I told Leo honestly. He didn't. Then maybe he's not ready to talk yet, Leo said with the simple wisdom that children sometimes possess. On the flight home to Munich, I finally listened to my father's voicemail. His voice was strained and sounded older somehow than it had just 24 hours earlier. Elena, love, I know you're upset, he began, his words careful and measured. And perhaps we handled things poorly. Natasha feels terrible about the misunderstanding. She says she tried to explain that it was just, well, you know how these things go. Could we try to work this out? I hate having you angry with me. And Leo, the look on that boy's face. Please call me back. I deleted the message without saving it. Over the next week, the calls continued with increasing frequency and desperation. Natasha's tone evolved from confusion to anger to something approaching panic as the financial reality of the situation became clear. My father's messages grew increasingly desperate as well, though they focused more on the emotional damage than the monetary consequences. The first few days were almost comical in their predictability. Natasha's voicemail started formal and condescending, as if she were addressing a misbehaving child rather than the woman who had been subsidizing her lifestyle for months. Elena, this little tantrum has gone far enough, she said in one particularly galling message. Your father is quite distressed, and frankly, this behavior is beneath someone of your education and background. Please call me back so we can resolve this misunderstanding like adults. But as the days passed and the financial implications became impossible to ignore, her tone shifted dramatically. The spa had called about her missed appointment. Apparently, she had been a regular client, charging 2,000 euro sessions to my card every Friday. The boutique in Vienna, where she had ordered a custom wardrobe for spring, had started calling about payment for pieces already in production. You have no idea what you've done, she hissed into my voicemail by day 4, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. Do you understand the commitments that were made based on that credit line? The embarrassment you've caused? Victor has worked his entire life, and he deserves better than this vindictive behavior from his own daughter. I found myself studying these messages like fascinating anthropological specimens. The entitlement was breathtaking. In Natasha's world, my generosity had somehow transformed into her right, and my withdrawal of that generosity was a personal attack rather than the natural consequence of her cruelty toward my son. My father's messages told a completely different story from Natasha's increasingly frantic calls. Where her voicemails were all about money and social embarrassment, Victor seemed genuinely bewildered by the magnitude of what he had lost. His first few messages were tentative, almost hopeful, as if he believed this could all be smoothed over with the right words. Elena, love, I know we need to talk, he said in one early message, his voice carrying that familiar paternal tone he used when trying to fix things. Perhaps I could drive down this weekend. We could sort this out over dinner, just the two of us. I know Leo loves that restaurant with the model trains. Maybe we could all go there. The casual way he mentioned Leo broke my heart all over again. It was as if nothing had fundamentally changed, as if his grandson would simply bounce back from being rejected and humiliated because of familiar surroundings and model trains. The disconnect between his actions and his expectations was staggering. I learned the full details of what had happened after we left through my Aunt Petra, who had a remarkable talent for extracting information from any situation. She had been the family's unofficial intelligence network for decades, somehow always knowing who was struggling, who was fighting, and who needed help or intervention. The atmosphere at dinner was absolutely dreadful, she told me during one of our regular phone calls. Petra lived in Nuremberg, close enough to Victor to stay informed, but far enough away to maintain some perspective on family drama. After you left, Natasha tried to pretend nothing significant had happened, Petra continued. She kept making bright conversation about the meal, complimenting her own cooking, and acting as if excluding you and Leo had been a perfectly reasonable social decision. And Dad? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Your father barely spoke during the entire meal. He kept looking toward the door as if you might come back. Klaus tried to ask about Leo. You know how he dotes on that boy. And Victor just deflated completely. He couldn't even explain what had happened. Petra paused, and I could hear her brewing tea in her kitchen, the familiar sounds of her evening routine providing a comforting backdrop to this painful conversation. Natasha finally got frustrated with the mood, she continued. She made some comment about how some people can't handle family dynamics properly, and how she was only trying to create an elegant atmosphere for Victor's special day. That's when your father finally spoke up. What did he say? He said, "My grandson calls me his best friend, and I just let someone turn him away from my door." Then he got up from the table and went to his study. He didn't come back out for the rest of the evening. As Petra continued her report, I learned that the financial implications of my actions had begun hitting immediately. The credit card had been maxed out the very morning of the birthday dinner. Natasha had planned an elaborate shopping trip to Vienna the following week, a 3-day excursion she had been organizing for months. It included personal shopping consultants, reservations at expensive restaurants, and appointments at exclusive boutiques. The Tesla was supposed to be delivered that Thursday. Victor had apparently been bragging about it to his colleagues for weeks, explaining how his successful daughter had insisted on buying it for him as an early retirement gift. He was so proud, Petra said sadly. He kept saying how generous you were, how lucky he was to have a daughter who had achieved so much. I think he genuinely saw it as proof that he had raised you well. Instead, he had been forced to call the dealership Wednesday morning and explain that the payment had been recalled. The conversation, according to Petra, who heard about it through Victor's neighbor, had been excruciating. The sales manager had been confused, then suspicious, then coolly professional as Victor tried to explain that there had been a family misunderstanding about the financing. The car went back to the lot that afternoon. Victor had to take a taxi home because Natasha refused to pick him up, claiming she was too embarrassed to be seen at the dealership. The Vienna trip was canceled next. Natasha had booked premium hotels, made dinner reservations at restaurants that required months of advance notice, and arranged private shopping appointments at boutiques that catered exclusively to wealthy clients. The deposits lost in cancellation fees alone amounted to several thousand euros, but it was the everyday expenses that seemed to hit hardest. The weekly spa appointments, the premium grocery shopping, the casual dining at expensive restaurants, all of it had been charged to my card for months. Faced with the reality of financing her lifestyle on Victor's modest pension, Natasha had apparently become, in Petra's diplomatic phrasing, quite difficult to live with. She's barely speaking to him, Petra told me. And when she does, it's to remind him that this is all his fault for not managing his family better. Those were her exact words. She keeps saying that in her previous marriage, her husband would never have allowed family members to interfere with their household decisions. I felt a flicker of satisfaction at that revelation, followed immediately by sadness. This wasn't the father I had grown up with. The Victor I knew would never have allowed anyone to treat his family this way. But as the days passed, I began to understand something more complex about my father's situation. Through Petra's updates and my own reflection over the following weeks, I realized that Victor hadn't just made one terrible decision at his birthday dinner. He had been making small compromises for months, maybe even years. Each one seemed insignificant on its own. But together, they had formed a pattern that led inevitably to that moment at his front door. She isolated him gradually, Petra observed during one of our conversations, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had watched family dynamics play out for decades. It started with little comments about how much time he spent on the phone with you and Leo. Then there were suggestions that maybe family visits should be coordinated better, planned more formally. She convinced him that she was trying to help him maintain better boundaries, make his retirement more peaceful. I remembered the signs I had dismissed at the time. The way our regular Sunday phone calls had become less frequent over the months. How Victor had started asking if it was convenient to visit rather than simply announcing when he would arrive, as he had done for years. The gradual reduction in his presence at family gatherings, always with reasonable explanations that seemed to originate from Natasha's social calendar. She made him believe that choosing her preferences was the same as being a good husband, Petra continued. And she framed any resistance as him being disloyal to their marriage. It's a classic pattern, really. You isolate the person from their support network, then become their primary source of emotional validation. This realization complicated my anger significantly. I was still furious with my father for his cowardice at the birthday dinner, but I began to understand that the man who had stood silently behind Natasha wasn't entirely the same person who had raised me. He had been systematically diminished, his confidence in his own judgment eroded by someone who benefited from his dependency on her approval. Meanwhile, Leo was struggling more than I had initially realized. The rejection at his grandfather's door had shaken something fundamental in his 7-year-old worldview. Children that age believe in fairness with an intensity that adults forget, and what had happened violated his basic understanding of how family was supposed to work. "Maybe I was too loud at Grandpa's house before," he said one evening while we were doing his homework together. "Maybe I should have used my inside voice more." The self-blame was devastating to witness. I knelt beside his chair and turned him to face me, needing him to see the sincerity in my eyes. "Leo, listen to me carefully," I said. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing. The way you behave, the way you talk, the way you play, all of that is perfect, exactly as it should be. What happened at Grandpa's house was about grown-up problems, not about you. But if I was quieter, maybe Natasha would have liked me better," he persisted, his young mind trying to find a solution he could control. "Sweetheart, Natasha's feelings about you have nothing to do with who you are as a person. Some grown-ups have problems that make them act badly toward children, but that's never the child's fault." Still, the damage was visible in ways that broke my heart. Leo became more subdued at school, less willing to speak up in class or join playground games with his usual enthusiasm. His teacher, Mrs. Olson, called to express concern about the change in his behavior. "He seems to be questioning himself more," she explained during our phone conversation. "Instead of jumping into activities the way he used to, he hangs back and watches to see if he's welcome first. It's heartbreaking, really. He's such a bright, enthusiastic child normally." I made an appointment with the school counselor, a gentle woman named Sophie who specialized in helping children process family transitions and trauma. After several sessions with Leo, she gave me insight that proved crucial to understanding what my son was experiencing. "Leo is dealing with what we call conditional love anxiety," she explained during one of our consultations. "He's learned that someone he trusted completely, his grandfather, could suddenly become unavailable to him based on circumstances beyond his control. Now he's wondering if other relationships in his life might be equally unstable. What can I do to help him?" I asked, feeling helpless in the face of my child's pain. "Consistency and predictability," Sophie replied. "Keep reinforcing that your love for him doesn't depend on his behavior or other people's approval. And be honest about the adult problems without making him feel responsible for fixing them." These conversations with Leo became a nightly ritual. We would curl up on his bed after reading stories, and he would ask questions that revealed the complexity of his 7-year-old processing of adult betrayal. "Do you think Grandpa still loves me even though he didn't choose me?" he asked one night. "I think Grandpa loves you very much, but he made a bad choice because he was confused about what was most important," I answered honestly. "Will you ever make a bad choice about me?" "I might make mistakes, sweetheart, but I will always choose you. That's what mothers do." "Even if you marry someone someday who doesn't like me?" The sophistication of the question startled me. At 7 years old, Leo was already working through the dynamics that had destroyed his relationship with his grandfather. "If I marry someone someday who doesn't like you, we'll figure out how to handle that together. But I would never ask you to choose between me and someone you love, and I'd hope your wife would never ask you to choose between her and your family." So Natasha asking Grandpa to choose was wrong? Yes, it was wrong. And Grandpa choosing her was wrong too? Yes, that was wrong too. These conversations were painful but necessary. Leo was learning important lessons about relationships, boundaries, and self-worth that would serve him throughout his life. But I grieved for the innocence he had lost, the unconditional trust in family that had been shattered by adult failures. By the end of the second week, the situation at Victor's house had deteriorated significantly. Petra called with updates that painted an increasingly grim picture of my father's marriage and the toll that the financial crisis was taking on both of them. "Natasha's sister came to visit yesterday," Petra reported during one of our evening phone calls. Apparently, she had been looking forward to seeing the new Tesla and having Natasha treat her to that fancy Vienna shopping weekend they had planned together. According to Petra's reliable network of neighborhood contacts, When Natasha's sister learned about the cancellations, there had been quite a scene. Natasha had been forced to explain to her sister, and by extension her entire social circle, that her stepdaughter had withdrawn financial support due to what she termed a family disagreement. The humiliation had been unbearable for someone who had spent months cultivating an image of affluent respectability among her peers. The sister apparently said some very harsh things about Victor's inability to control his family, Petra continued. She suggested that perhaps Natasha had married beneath her station, that she should have known better than to get involved with someone whose previous family relationships were so complicated. It was loud enough that the neighbors heard it through the windows. I found myself feeling almost sorry for my father as I listened to these reports. He was trapped in a marriage that had revealed its true nature under financial pressure. Almost sorry, but not quite there yet. How is he handling it? I asked. Poorly. He's lost weight, looks exhausted all the time. I think he's starting to realize what he's traded away, but he doesn't know how to fix it. Pride, maybe, or fear of admitting such a massive mistake. The breaking point came during the third week, and it wasn't what I expected. Victor had been trying to maintain some normalcy in his life, still going to his weekly chess club at the community center, and still meeting his old colleague Niels for coffee on Thursday mornings. These were simple pleasures that had been part of his routine for years. But Natasha had become increasingly controlling about these activities, viewing them as unnecessary expenses, and questioning why he needed social contact outside their marriage. Every euro spent on coffee or the small fees for chess club tournaments became a source of conflict. The crisis occurred at the chess club, and I learned about it when Niels called me directly. Victor had been playing with the same group of men for 15 years, a collection of retirees who gathered every Tuesday evening to play matches and discuss politics, sports, and their grandchildren. Victor had always been the most enthusiastic grandfather in the group, frequently showing photos of Leo and sharing stories of their adventures together. According to Niels, Victor had arrived at chess club that Tuesday, looking haggard and distracted, clearly troubled by something. When the conversation turned to grandchildren, as it always did during these gatherings, the other men began asking about Leo with their usual interest and affection. "How's that grandson of yours, Victor?" one of them asked. "Still beating you at checkers?" "When's he coming to visit again?" asked another. "My grandson would love to meet him. They're about the same age." "You must have some new pictures," said a third. "That boy changes so fast." Victor had broken down completely, right there in the community center, surrounded by men who had known him for decades. "He started crying and couldn't stop," Niels explained during our phone call. "He was sobbing, Elena," Niels said, his voice heavy with concern. I've never seen a man cry like that with such complete despair. Victor had told them everything. The birthday dinner, Natasha's demands, how he had stood there and let his grandson be turned away from his own front door. The chess club members, practical men in their 60s and 70s who had lived through their own family dramas, had responded with surprising gentleness. They had helped Victor to a quiet corner, brought him water, and listened as he poured out the whole story of what his marriage had cost him. They were furious, Niels continued. Not at Victor, well, they were disappointed in him, but they were angry at the situation. Several of them have been through divorces, remarriages, blended family issues. They understood how these things can spiral out of control when you're not paying attention. What did they tell him? Old Johann. You remember Johann, the one who used to be a ship captain. He looked Victor straight in the eye and said, "Son, you can get another wife. You cannot get another grandson, and that boy won't be 7 years old forever, waiting for you to come to your senses." That night, Victor had apparently gone home and confronted Natasha directly. Not about the money. That bridge had already been burned beyond repair, but about the fundamental issue that had caused everything else to fall apart. According to what Petra learned the next day, Victor told Natasha that he wanted Leo and me to be welcome in their home again. He said that his family was non-negotiable, and if she couldn't accept that, they needed to reconsider their marriage. Natasha's response had been volcanic. According to the neighbors' reports, which filtered through Petra's intelligence network, the argument had lasted for hours and involved considerable shouting that could be heard through the walls. Natasha had accused Victor of being manipulated by me, of allowing his spoiled daughter to control his decisions, of choosing chaos over the peaceful life she had worked to create for them. She told him he had to choose, Petra said quietly when she called me with the update. Her or us? She said she wouldn't live in a house where she had to compete with his previous family for attention and resources. And what did Dad say? He asked her to leave. The words hung in the air between us as Petra delivered this news. After months of compromises and capitulations, after allowing himself to be gradually isolated from the people who loved him most, Victor had finally found his backbone and stood up to Natasha's ultimatum. But the victory felt hollow to me. I wasn't ready to forgive him, and I wasn't sure Leo was ready to trust him again. The damage had been done, and asking Natasha to leave didn't automatically repair the hurt he had caused by choosing her in the first place. Still, it was a beginning of sorts. Victor came to my apartment 3 days later. Leo was at school, which was probably for the best. I wasn't sure either of us was ready for that conversation yet. I invited Victor in, but didn't offer coffee, a small but deliberate signal that this wasn't a social visit. We sat in my living room with silence stretching between us like a canyon. "I've made a mess of things," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. I waited, not helping him with words or encouragement. He needed to say this on his own. Natasha. She had very specific ideas about how the birthday should go, he continued, his words careful and measured. She felt that including too many people would make it chaotic, less elegant. She wanted it to be special. "By excluding your grandson?" I asked, my voice sharper than I had intended. Victor winced visibly at the directness of the question. She didn't see it that way. She thought Leo might be disruptive. Children at formal dinners, you know. "It was a family birthday, Dad, not a state dinner," I replied, my frustration evident. "I know that now," he said quietly. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture I remembered from my childhood when he was wrestling with difficult decisions. God, Elena, the look on Leo's face. I've been seeing it for 3 weeks straight. I can't sleep. Then why didn't you say something? The question I had been carrying like a stone in my chest for weeks finally emerged. Why did you just stand there? Victor was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I'm a coward. Because I've gotten comfortable, and Natasha, she can make life very difficult when she's displeased. And because I convinced myself that you'd understand, that we could fix it later. He paused, struggling with the admission. I thought our relationship was strong enough to weather one disappointing evening. It wasn't about one evening, Dad, I said, feeling the anger rise in my chest again. It was about you choosing her comfort over your family, over Leo. I know, he said simply. We sat in silence again, and I could hear children playing in the courtyard outside, their voices bright and carefree. It made me think of Leo, who had been unusually quiet since the birthday weekend, still processing what had happened in his own 7-year-old way. He asks about you, I said finally, deciding to share this painful truth. Leo, he wants to know if Grandpa still loves him. Victor made a sound like he had been physically punched. Of course I love him. God, Elena, he's the light of my life. You both are. Then why didn't you choose us? It was the simplest question and the most complicated one, cutting to the heart of everything that had gone wrong. Victor stared at his hands for a long time before answering, and when he did, his honesty was brutal and necessary. Because I'm selfish, he said. Because at my age, I was afraid of being alone again. Because Natasha makes me feel young and wanted, and I didn't want to risk losing that comfort. And because I made the mistake of thinking that your love, both of yours, was unconditional, that no matter what I did, you'd forgive me. The honesty was devastating in its completeness. Here was my father, stripped of all pretense and justification, admitting to the ugly truth about his choices. Well, I said after a moment, you were wrong. I know, he replied. He looked up at me then, and I saw my father clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not the heroic figure of my childhood, but a flawed, frightened man who had made terrible choices out of weakness and selfishness. The money, taking it back. It was fair, he said. More than fair. I know you could have let us struggle to figure out what happened, but you made your point immediately and clearly. It wasn't about making a point, Dad, I corrected him. It was about consequences. Actions have consequences. Yes, he nodded slowly, accepting this truth. They do. Victor stood to leave, pausing at the door with the uncertain air of someone who wasn't sure what came next. Is there any chance you might forgive me eventually? He asked. I considered the question seriously, looking at the man standing in my doorway. He was my father, the person who had raised me and loved me, who had been my anchor through my mother's death and my divorce. But he was also the man who had broken his grandson's heart and stood silently by while it happened. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe, but not today. And not until you figure out what kind of man you want to be. He nodded, accepting this conditional possibility of future forgiveness. And Leo, he started to say. Leo is 7 years old, I interrupted. He loved you unconditionally, and you hurt him badly. If you want a relationship with your grandson, you need to earn it back from him, not from me. After he left, I called in sick to work and picked Leo up early from school. We went for ice cream and talked about complicated things like love and disappointment and forgiveness, concepts that seemed too heavy for a 7-year-old, but that life had forced him to grapple with anyway. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, I told him as we sat at our favorite parlor. Even grown-ups we love very much. Did Grandpa make a mistake? He asked, spooning chocolate ice cream thoughtfully. Yes, he did. Will he say sorry? I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so. 3 months later, Victor called again. This time his voice was different, steadier, more like the father I remembered from my childhood. There was a quality to his tone that suggested he had done some serious thinking and soul-searching during our period of separation. Natasha and I are separating, he said without preamble, getting straight to the point. It should have happened weeks ago, but I suppose I needed time to accept that I had chosen the wrong person to prioritize. I didn't say anything immediately, letting his words settle between us. This wasn't entirely unexpected news, given what Petra had been reporting about the state of their marriage, but hearing it directly from Victor felt significant. I know this doesn't fix what I did, he continued, his voice carrying genuine humility. And I know it doesn't erase Leo's hurt or yours, but I wanted you to know that I've learned something important during these months. A comfortable life isn't worth a meaningless one. What are you going to do? I asked, genuinely curious about his plans for rebuilding his life at 65. I'm going to try to become the man my grandson believed I was, he said simply. The father you deserved. I don't know if it's possible at my age, but I'm going to try. It was a start, and perhaps that was all any of us could ask for at this point. The road back wasn't quick or easy. Trust, once broken, doesn't repair itself overnight, especially when a child has been involved. But Victor proved his commitment through small, consistent actions rather than grand gestures or empty promises. He moved to a modest flat closer to Munich, giving up the comfortable suburban house he had shared with Natasha. It was a deliberate choice to be geographically closer to Leo and me, and also a symbolic gesture of leaving behind the life that had led to such poor decisions. Victor began calling Leo every Tuesday and Thursday evening, just to talk about school and checkers and model rockets. These weren't calls seeking forgiveness or trying to rush the healing process. They were simply opportunities for grandfather and grandson to reconnect on Leo's terms. Most importantly, Victor never pressured us for visits or tried to manipulate our emotions. He asked permission before coming to see us, respected the boundaries I set, and never once mentioned Natasha or the complications she had brought into our lives. It was as if he understood that moving forward required leaving that entire chapter behind. But perhaps most significantly, Victor apologized. Not just to me, but to Leo. And it wasn't a casual, "I'm sorry" designed to make himself feel better. It was a sincere, complete apology that acknowledged exactly what he had done wrong and why it had been hurtful. I chose someone else's feelings over yours, he told his grandson during one of their supervised visits at a neutral location. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. You are one of the most important people in my life, and I failed to show you that when it mattered most. Leo, being 7 years old and possessing the remarkable capacity for forgiveness that children often have, accepted this apology with the seriousness it deserved. It's okay, Grandpa, he said after thinking about it carefully. But next time, can you choose me? Every time, Victor promised, his voice thick with emotion. Every single time. Today, a year later, Victor and Leo are rebuilding their friendship step by step. It's different now. There's a caution that wasn't there before. A awareness that relationships require active maintenance and conscious choices. Leo is more thoughtful about trust, less automatically assuming that love means unconditional acceptance of poor treatment. But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. He's learning that love doesn't mean accepting poor treatment, that standing up for yourself is sometimes necessary even with people you care about. These are valuable lessons that will serve him well throughout his life. Victor, for his part, is learning that respect and love aren't the same thing. He's discovering that true relationships require choosing each other actively and repeatedly, especially when it's difficult. The comfortable assumption that family bonds are unbreakable has been replaced with a more mature understanding that relationships require work and conscious decisions. As for me, I learned that financial independence isn't just about personal security. It's about having the power to enforce your values when they're challenged. The money I withdrew, the credit card I canceled. These weren't acts of revenge or spite. They were acts of self-respect and boundary setting. They were me saying, if you don't value our relationship enough to treat us with basic consideration, then you don't get to benefit from our generosity. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behavior. Sometimes, walking away is the only thing that creates space for real change and growth. My father and I are still rebuilding our relationship too. It's slower going with adults. We have longer memories, more complicated pride, and deeper wounds to heal. But we're trying, and that effort matters. The willingness to do the hard work of repair, even when it's uncomfortable, is what ultimately makes relationships worth saving. The birthday gift Leo made, that photo album with the carefully drawn borders around pictures of grandfather and grandson, sits on Victor's coffee table now. He shows it to anyone who visits, explaining that it was made by his grandson, his best friend. It serves as a reminder of what he almost lost and what he's working to rebuild. The boy who taught him that love without respect is just comfortable selfishness, and that real family means choosing each other, especially when it's hard, every single time. It took a broken birthday dinner, a canceled credit card, and a recalled Tesla down payment for my father to learn what my 7-year-old son knew instinctively. Real family means choosing each other, especially when it's difficult every time.